Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Today is your lucky day because today we're going to see Azure Functions. But before we get down to the nuts and bolts, let's talk a little bit about what an Azure Function is. Azure Functions is a serverless solution that allows you to write less code, maintain less infrastructure, and actually save on expenses. You don't have to worry anymore about deploying and maintaining resources. The cloud infrastructure instead does this for you. It provides all the resources you need in order to keep your application up and running. Among other things, we can use Azure Functions to create web APIs, process real-time data, respond to database changes, or message a queue system. Azure provides a very simplified and user-friendly development environment for us. On top of that, it helps you break down big architectures into smaller pieces of code. In fact, and we will see this in a little bit, Azure provides templates with code so you can start building your own solution right away. Without further ado, let's dive into the practical details of Azure Functions.
Apparently, the first thing we need to do here is type function app on the search bar and hit that button here where it says function app, and then click create function app, select your subscription, then your resource group, and then choose a function app name. So let's call it function does app does example does YouTube. Hopefully it's not taken. Yeah, that's fine. Runtime stack, I'm using Python 3.9 West Europe. Here we are. Plan operating system Linux by default, and then plan you choose consumption serverless. That means you pay as much as you consume. Be careful with that. You don't want to pay extra if you are not using it. So just use this option here, unless of course the company is paying, then you can use whatever you want. But if you have a personal account on Azure, click I think it's better to use consumption serverless. And then we need to create a storage account. That means we need to create a new storage account where we, let's say, send data from our HTTP request or something like that, that is connected. So basically a storage account only for our function app. So we connect the storage account with this particular function app, and then you have to create a new one. Let's call it function app YouTube. Okay, that's perfect. Function app YouTube. Okay, we click OK. Networking, enable public access on, that's fine. Monitoring, yes, we need monitoring to enable application insights, that's fine. Deployment, GitHub disabled, okay, yep. Tags, we don't need tags. And then review and create, click the create here, and it takes a couple of minutes in order to be created, so I will come back once it is done. Splendid. The deployment is complete. That means we can use our resource here. So we click go to resource, and here we have the function app. One function app can contain multiple functions. However, Microsoft recommends that we use one function app for each function. Okay, so let's start with a very simple example. Let's create a function. Click on the Functions blade on the left panel, then click on Create. By default, Azure Functions provide you templates. So let's say we want to create an endpoint where we receive requests, HTTP requests, and we return a response. We can use the HTTP trigger template. And this, as the description says, will create a function that will be run whenever it receives an HTTP request, responding based on data in the body or query string. So let's use that. It's a very common template. Click on create, and this will create an Azure function. Now, the cool thing about that is by default, it will give you the code, a sample code, not a very advanced one, apparently. Here I have already executed another function before, that's why you see this spike here. So you won't have the spike when you first create the function. Then you click on code plus test, and here we will have two files, one Python file, which is this one, and one JSON file, a function.json. So if you click on the drop-down menu on the bar and you click on function.json, you see here the configuration about our function, Azure function. The authorization level, we specify the authorization level. Function, that here that means that we need a function API key in order to have access to our endpoint, but let's change that to anonymous, and that means that you don't have everyone can access our endpoint. The type is HTTP trigger because the trigger is an HTTP request. Direction in because we receive HTTP requests. Name, whatever name you want. Methods, get, and post. And then we also have to specify our response. That means type would be HTTP, and direction is out because it's our response to the outside world, I guess. And name, you have to return our return value. You have to use the $sign here in front. Don't ask me why. That's how Azure, does it. But let's see the Python file here. They need Python file. Cancel. I didn't change anything, did I? Yeah, okay, that's fine. This is our init Python file here. We can use the logging module in our Azure Functions. It seamlessly integrate with Azure Functions, so that's perfect. We don't have to do anything. Then we need to import Azure Functions as func, and we need to specify our HTTP request from this Azure.functions library and the HTTP response. Here we have the typical logging info, and what essentially are doing here is we are trying to get the name as a query parameter, and if we don't find it, then we try to get it as from the body of the request, and this is what we do here. And if we get something, if we get a value from this parameter, then we return this response, hello name, this HTTP triggered function executed successfully, else we return this response with status code equals 200. Now, how you can test that? Actually, Azure Functions provide this test run option here. So if you click that, you will get this, let's say, panel. And you can specify the HTTP method. By default, it's post because actually we are trying to pass a parameter here. So if you click on the add parameter, query parameter, just enter a name. Here we are expecting name as a parameter, enter value, test, 1, 2, 3, right? And then we click on run. And this will give us an output now. You will see it now. Okay, that's HTTP response is 200, response code okay, and this is the content of our response, which is here, hello, test 1, 2, 3, this HTTP triggered function executed successfully. This is the part right here. Now you can, instead of a query parameter, just remove that and pass it on in the body of the request. So if we do that and name and test example, and click on run, and you will see this, the same output, but we would be getting the name parameter from our body. Exactly, perfect. So another feature that you can see on Azure Functions is the get function URL. By default, it has the key to default and then the URL. That means it provides you the URL where we host our endpoint. So you click on the copy and then you paste it here and you will see our response. Now we don't have any authorization level here. It's anonymous. That means everyone can access, can hit our endpoint. But the cool thing about this, the cool feature is actually that essentially you have already created an endpoint and you can start writing code, and you don't have to worry where you are hosting, and all this stuff. This is a very, very simple example, but let's do something more comprehensive and actually use our local VS Code or local editor in order to develop develop something more comprehensive, of course, based on this example. If we go back on Azure, let's remove our function here. Let's delete it. I will tell you why. We are going to develop the code using our editor, local editor, and you can do that. You can see the steps. Actually, there is a cool guide here. If you click on create again, and instead of using developing portal, let's click on develop on any editor plus core tools, and this will give you all those commands here. So you open your CMD and you start running those commands. Of course, you need to have to install node.js first, otherwise this is not going to run. And then you click on func init after you have created, uh, after you have already specified your folder. You click func init and that creates an Azure function project. You create a new function by using this command func new, and when you are ready, then you click on func start and it's going to run your function locally. Okay, so this is my command line. I have created a new directory in my desktop, and now I'm going to run all the commands one by one, the commands I just showed you. So let me copy that from Azure and paste it here, and we run this first one. I have already run it, so it's not going to install anything new, but let's run this one. The next one would be func init. Okay, and then func init. It's going to create, it's going to ask us actually which option to use for our worker runtime. I'm using Python, and then you see it created all those files here in our directory. So if we type dir, you will see all the files that the func init command created, and we have git ignore, VS Code, getting started. It has this getting started file has all these instructions, host.json, local settings, requirements.txt, where we install dependencies. Now let's create a new function, and we can do that by typing func new, and it's going to create a new function. Let's select again an HTTP trigger template, but you can see there are many templates here. Actually, I didn't know that there are that many. And that's pretty cool if you think about it, because it gives you a good template on how to start. You don't have to search to Google stuff or use Chat GPT. But yeah, this is a very cool feature. So we click on HTTP trigger, function name, let's call it function YouTube. Click, yep, that's perfect. Let me move to VS Code now. We can see what we have created. This is our directory with all the code that we created when we typed func new, and by default it creates all those files here. The init file contains the code exactly as uh, what we saw, like on Azure Function on the Azure portal. The function JSON, as we said, contains the configuration for our API and points to the init Python file. Git ignore, it's the git ignore, so if you don't want to publish anything on Git, just use git ignore. Host, it contains the global configuration for our function app. Local settings contains a configuration for and connections string for our local environment, so we can test it locally. And requirements contains all the dependencies that should be installed when on Azure on the Azure environment when we publish our project. But here you can also find this getting started file, which contains information about every file that we were provided. And as you can see, the local settings.json is used to store app settings and connection strings when running locally. This file doesn't get published to Azure. So we don't publish this file to Azure, it's just for our local settings. Requirements.txt contains the list of Python packages the system installs when publishing to Azure. And host.json contains global configuration options that affect all functions in a function app. This file does get published to Azure. Of course, we have the .vs Code and the virtual environment and Dockerfile, etc., etc. But let's focus on the main files. Now, what can you do here? Now, we have the same function. So if you want to test it locally, you just type func and start, and it's going to run this our API locally. So if you follow this link, it's going on your web browser. You will see exactly what we saw on Azure portal when we tested our API. Let me switch to Postman. Postman is the perfect tool when you want to test an API. If you are not familiar, I think you should play around with Postman. But what you do essentially is you create a new request, let's say get or post request, and then you place your URL here of your API. You pass the parameters here. In our body we pass name as Azure, and then we click send, and it's going to return the result. Instead, you can do that on your browser, but I think Postman is a much better option, and I think it's you should know it. You should play around with Postman if you haven't used it before. It's perfect for testing APIs. Okay, so well, now we know how to host an API on Azure Functions and how to test it locally, right? It's very easy. Let's do something a bit different. Let's create a container. So if you go on to your storage accounts, remember when we created our Azure Function app, you have to attach it with a storage account. And this is the storage account we created at the beginning of the video, right? And here under containers, let's create a new container called test, and let's provide the access to that container so we can read our data from an anonymous request. I will tell you why we do that, because we want actually to upload the file in our container. Here you click on the upload button, Let's upload the file, a txt file, and click on upload. And here is our txt file. You can see the data we have on this file using the edit. If you click the edit button here. So let's say, how can we read from our code the data from this txt file? So you click the three dots here, and then you click on generate SAS, and that will create, for HTTP only, it's going to generate a SAS token and URL. So click on that, and then click on the URL, copy to clipboard, and save it somewhere. Let me copy the code because I'm too lazy to actually type today. So in our init file, we are going to create a function, display blob, and we can do that by importing this library Azure Storage Blob. So if you don't have it, pip install Azure Storage, and from Azure Storage we are going to import Blob client. I will provide you the code afterwards, don't worry about that. So we create a function here, we pass the connection string from blob URL, we take the connection string, so we create actually a blob client to create a connection with our blob storage, and then we download blob in the file. So, and then we just type the comments. We type the content of this file by using download blob.readall. It's pretty simple, and you don't have to do a lot, just 3 lines of code actually. And in order to do that, let's call this display blob function here, and we also have to create our connection string, and the connection string of course is the URL we copied from our SAS from our Azure portal, our SAS URL token. And let me copy that as well. So connection string is this one, right? Perfect. And here now we are going, every time we hit our API, it's going to provide us the content of this txt file using this command here. So if we run that func start, and then let me yeah, it's up and running in our local environment. Let me use Postman again to hit the API, and it takes some time. My computer is not the best, as you can tell. Let me, yep. So here, as you can see, somewhere in the comments, yeah, this is our content from our txt file. We used logging.info, that's why it's this is the format. But that's here you can see how you can read the content from a file, and that's how you connect to the blob storage on Azure via Python. It's pretty easy, as you can tell. 3 lines of code, you import the library, and you just read the content of that specific txt file or JSON file or whatever you want. Now let's do something different. Let's say we want to send to our blob storage, to our storage account, we want to send a message in the queue, right? This is what you can do with that. So when we trigger, let's say, the API, we want to send a message. What we provided as a parameter, we want to see it in our message queue in our storage account. How you do that? First of all, let me copy this line of code here. We have to pass in our main function a parameter called whatever you want. We call it message, and func out, that means it's going, that's the output of our function. And here, so we pass our parameter here, that would be an output to our function. And instead of this, let me copy the rest of the code I have here. So basically, essentially, it's the same thing, except for this part. So we set the message, the name here, and we return a HTTP response. But here, this is the key part. We said as a message, we set this name, the parameter that we passed. So now in our storage queue, we will display this message. But before we test that, we have to go under function.json, which contains, all this configuration, and we need to add this part right here. Underneath the type HTTP direction out and name, we have to add this part, which says type is queue and direction is out, and the name is message and queue name is output, whatever you want. Connection Azure Web Storage, which is the default storage account we have when we created with our Azure Functions. Now, how can you test this? Actually, I don't think you can test it locally, so you have to publish the app. How can you publish the app? Actually, you take the command in our initial, when we created our Azure function, you have it provides those commands that you have to run. And remember, at the bottom it was the command to run your Azure function. This is the command in order to publish to Azure. Func Azure function app publish your function app name, right? But before I hit that button, let me tell you that you can actually change the init file. So you can name it whatever you want. Let's rename it. Rename, and then let's say it's example. And here under our function.json, you just point to the new file. So it doesn't have to be init always. You can use whatever you want. However, in your Python file, you have to use the main function. I try to use other functions, but it doesn't recognize. It recognizes the main keyword first, it seems only. So just use main, and then if you go on to use another, like function, just define a new function, but your main function has to be named as main. Otherwise, it's not going to work. At least I've tried that and it didn't work. Now, one more thing, we need to add the following libraries here, the requests library and the Azure Storage Blob, right? Because we read from our Blob Storage. And now this requirements txt will be published on Azure, and then Azure will install those libraries. Otherwise, it's going to give you an error. Let's save our requirements file and our example file and our function file, and then click that button here in order to publish to our Azure environment. It will take a couple of minutes, so I will get back to you when it's done. We successfully published our function app. You will see it on our Azure portal under functions. You will see we published this function here. Now, if you go under code and test, you will see our new files, a newly created files, the example.py and the function JSON, which contains also the queue output, right? So if we go back to our example, here we can test and add a name parameter as a query parameter. Just click this is a test and click the run button. Yep, correctly. It gave us a response. Hello, this is a test. And now if we go back to our storage account, you will see under queues, you will see a queue named output, because that's how we define that in our function.json. And if you click the output, you will see the message text, which is perfect. This is how you can actually send data to your queue in your storage account via Python. And go back to our function app example and click on the functions. Here, another thing I want to show you is the monitor key, the monitor blade. It takes some time in order to, it takes up to 5 minutes, I think, in order to be refreshed. So it's not instant, so you have to wait a few minutes. But if there is an error, like for me, when I run it, I forgot to publish the requirements txt, the new dependencies that we added, the request and the Azure storage blob, and that gave it an error. So, and here you can actually check your error, but it takes up to 5 minutes, right? And this is how you can actually write your own code in your editor or VS Code and publish, make changes, test it locally, publish your results to Azure portal, and you can test and run it here, or you can use the get function URL and test your URL. As you can see, functions in Azure are very, very easy to handle.
In a nutshell, with Azure Functions, you don't have to worry about the infrastructure. The serverless computing handles everything for you. Second, Azure provides automatic scaling. That means you can scale up and down as you please. And last but not least, you pay as much as you consume, which is very important. If the employer pays for you, that's fine. But if you have a private account, it's a factor to consider. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like the video, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.